Okay, class, this is part two of chapter 13 on family. Part one, we discussed the definitions of family, and then we talked about the changes that we've seen in the family structure and familial roles, past and present. Part two is going to hone in on some of those changes that we can see in modern families. Um, and so we'll pick right up where we left off. So there are kind of two ways we can split our discussion about how families are changing. We can focus on the changes related to marriage, and we can focus on the changes related to parenting. So we're going to begin by focusing on the changes related to marriage. And this would include our discussion about why we have less people in our society who are married than previous decades, as well as a discussion of the rise in people who are divorced, and also an acknowledgement of the people who are never married and the fact that we have seen an increase in those folks as well. But before we get into a discussion of those changes, we'll begin with just some definitions. So, marriage is the legally recognized union between two people in which they are united sexually, cooperate economically, and may give birth to, adopt, or rear children. It is the socially approved mating relationship, and people expect it to be stable and enduring. And if you've ever been to a wedding, you know that people have that expectation because it's right there in the vows. And normally, when I present this information in class, um, when I ask people, if they are married or if they expect to get married someday, you know, do they think that their marriage will last? Or I might say, how many times do you expect to get married? And the answer is always, that they only expect to get married once, they expect their marriage to last. And this is notable just because we live in a society where divorces become more common. Um, that and, and and therefore people are more likely to be children of divorce or know people who have gotten a divorce. Prenuptial agreements, which is just kind of the legal contract that people uh, make with one another before getting married. These have become more common, and we also are starting to see growing awareness and acknowledgement of open marriages and other forms of polyamory, which all kind of push back against this idea that marriage, that monogamy, is an enduring or it should be expected to be enduring in our society. But despite all these challenges to the definition, it's worth noting that a lot of people will indicate that for themselves they have every expectation that they will get married someday, that they will only get married once, and that marriage will last. Now, why do people marry? This used to be a much more straightforward answer if you think back to the pre agricultural era, where people were more likely to marry for rational financial purposes. Women, of course, because they were not given uh, full kind of rights to participate into society, in terms of work and education. They pretty much had to marry. The expectation was you move from your father's household to your husband's household. And because men were the sole breadwinners in their families, that meant that, certainly one of the more compelling kind of reasons behind why people chose the partner that they did had a lot to do with kind of their finances. Were they capable of taking care of you? And so there was this kind of real focus on economics. Love did not really gain mainstream acceptance as being a kind of real reason to get married and to pursue a marital relationship until that early 1900s, and as we kind of transitioned away from being an agrarian society into an industrial society where people worked in factories. We also started to see, of course, um, the kind of beginnings of women having a little bit more freedom and liberty in public spaces. And so, and we see also, of course, the development of the separate spheres as men went off to work. And for the most part, women stayed home, and the home was no longer an economic space. And so we see during this time the rise of the companionate marriage. And at the heart of the companionate marriage was the idea that, love and emotion were how you chose this person that you wanted to build a life with. And so all of this, as I've been talking, I've been talking primarily about monogamy because in America, this is the type of marriage that we have traditionally practiced. The idea that a person can only have one spouse at a time. Now there are other societies and cultures where there has been a practice of polygamy, where a person has more than one marital partner at a time, but that is prohibited in the United States, despite TV shows that have kind of shown a light on people who still practice that lifestyle. But it's worth noting that in a society where in any given year, 4 out of 10 new marriages involve remarriage, where since post 1970s, 1980s, we've had this fairly high number of people who've gotten a divorce, and a solid number of whom then go on to remarry. Perhaps monogamy isn't really the best way to describe the pattern of marriage that we see in America, which has led to the development of the term serial monogamy, where yes, people only have one wife or husband at a time. But they have more than one over the span of their lifetime. And as the definition notes, this has become the kind of growing characteristic, or this kind of definition has been growing in popularity in the United States in the last few decades. Now, one major change we've seen in regards to marriage has, of course, been the expansion of marriage rights. And I'm going to go over this pretty quickly because we went over this when we had the sexuality chapter. But, we've come a long way since, the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, which, defined marriage as being between a man and a woman. By 2004, we had our first state, Massachusetts, that allowed gay marriage. And then during the Obama years, he instructed the DOJ to no longer defend DOMA in court. And by the end of those years in 2015, the Supreme Court upheld in Obergefell versus Hodges that states have to allow same-sex couples to marry. Before that, some states did. Some states allowed domestic partnerships but would not call them marriages. And of course, some states did not allow for either. But after Obergefell Hodges in 2015, marriage rights were fully extended to the homosexual population in the United States. And so, at least based on our 2017 data, which is not as good as census data, but that'll be coming in a few years down the pipeline, because of course this is a census year. But based on the data collection in 2017, there were 400,000 same-sex couples. 487,000 are married couples. So, this is not a nominal number of people that we are referring to. And this legal same-sex marriage, is worth noting that, there are a lot of countries, primarily in Africa, Asia, Russia, but also some parts of Latin America, where same-sex marriage is still not legal. And you can kind of just see there on our global map which states have legalized marriage. Um, those states or those countries are in blue. Now, one trend that has happened, in addition to kind of this expansion of marital rights, an additional trend that we note in regards to marriage is that people are postponing marriage. Men and women are getting married on average about 7 years later now than in 1950. And so, you kind of see two graphs there that kind of speak to the changing age of first marriage. And because more people are waiting till later to get married, you can see that the share of Americans between the ages of 20 to 24 who are currently married, um, that percentage has decreased over time. And why are people delaying marriage? The easy answer is that they're spending more time in education and on developing their careers before saying I do. There are more women with that are in the labor force, that are pursuing labor force opportunities. So that old option of you can only go from your father's household to your husband's household no longer holds up. Certainly, with the increase in birth control technology, as well as the availability of legal abortion, there are just less shotgun marriages. There are less people, getting married because they have to, because they're afraid to have sex outside of marriage because of the consequences, or because they did have sex outside of marriage and now feel like they have to marry, and because they have to raise a child. And then it's just worth noting that with economic conditions and uncertainty, in the last few decades, more and more people are just saying that they want some level of financial stability on their own, before they uh, join join their life with someone else. And this does represent a shift in perspective. Instead of people necessarily saying we are going to build this together, you have more people now kind of saying I want to build a certain level of security first, before I even bring in anyone else. So, kind of a consequence of this has been a drop in overall childbearing. Family sizes have gotten smaller, and part of this may have to do with the fact that some people are just opting to not have children at all. Some people just do not want as big of families, as we've seen in the past. But some of it also has to do with the fact that if you are getting married later and you're waiting to be financially stable before you marry or have children, that women are seeing their kind of childbearing years kind of condensed. They're spending more of that time, getting an education, starting a career, finding the right partner, which doesn't leave them as much time to have as many children. Um, a good thing, of course, is that there is greater freedom in forming these relationships. That people are put a lot more pressure on themselves than in years past about finding the one, and because they have all this additional time to do it. And certainly, one thing that maybe has contributed to this waiting to marry has been an increase in cohabitation, which is the sharing of a household by an unmarried couple. This was uh, really rare, in the 1970s, like less than 1%. And now, as we go into 2020, once again, we don't have our best data because we don't have the census data yet. It is, somewhere between 7 and 8%. And these are both heterosexual couples. Your book gives data from 2016, which says it's 7 million heterosexual couples, as well as same-sex couples. 500,000 same-sex couples cohabit. The interesting thing about cohabitation is a lot of people will say that they are cohabiting to practice for marriage, or considering marriage, or to prepare them for marriage. But the data, in regards to the question, does cohabitation lead to better marriages? um, the data behind that is a little surprising for some people, because the answer is no. Cohabiting does not lead to a better marriage. It actually increases the likelihood that you will, it decreases the likelihood that you will marry, and it increases the likelihood that if you do marry, that you will get a divorce. And that second one, that the fact that people who cohabit are more likely to get a divorce, we call that the cohabitation effect. And we don't really have a great explanation as to the underlying logic behind that effect. People offer a couple of explanations, one of which is the role of inertia sliders, that people who cohabit and then get married aren't really that excited or into the idea of getting married. They just kind of slide into it because they're living together, and at some point they're just like, okay, we might as well do this. But that lack of intentionality kind of rears its ugly head when they face rough times in the marriage, and it makes it more likely that they will be willing to throw in the towel. Um, Another definition is just a selection effect, meaning that if you think about the type of people who are least likely to get a divorce, the really religious, they're also the same type of people who are least likely to do something like cohabit. While people who maybe have more progressive, tolerant, liberal views are more likely to cohabit, and they are more likely to consider getting a divorce, and to get a divorce when things get bad in their marriage. But like I said, we don't have a perfect explanation of what's going on, but we do know that if the question is, does cohabitation lead to you having a better marriage? All data points to no. And so when we talk about better marriages and divorce, it now brings up, of course, another one of our major changes um, in the modern family, which is, of course, the kind of increase in divorces, and then even when it leveled off at a fairly high divorce rate. So divorce is the legal process of dissolving a marriage, and today's divorce rate is about 3 times what it was a century ago. About 20% of marriages end within 5 years, and in 20 years, half of marriages end. So these are the statistics from your book. You see some graphs there that kind of give you some data about how, the percentage of Americans who are divorced. We can see a little bit of racial trends there, with African Americans being slightly more than whites, Latinos being slightly a little being less, and Asian Americans being least likely to be divorced. And you can see that the divorce rate over time has had some spikes, and even after spiking in the 80s, it never fully declined to the rates that we saw like back in the 1930s, or 1950s. Um, and this just gives you a look at what it looks like on a national level map, which states have the highest divorce rate, which states have average, and which states have the lowest. And you might find this a little surprising, that a state like New York has lower rates than North Carolina, or that a state like California has a higher rate or has a lower rate than a state like Texas. um, Why do people divorce? Why do people divorce? The answer to that question can be split into 3 categories. There are societal level reasons, there are like demographic kind of factors we can point to, and then there are micro level reasons. At the societal level, a big one is the change in divorce laws, and we'll talk about that in upcoming slides. But certainly, the passage of no-fault divorce laws dramatically uh, increased the number of divorces that we had after the passage of those laws. Religious institutions. So, societies that are strongly religious, particularly if those religions take a very strong stance against divorce, then that makes people less likely to divorce. The economy. Interestingly enough, when things are going, even though finances are usually one of the main things that couples fight about, when we are going through an economic recession, divorces actually decrease, usually because people just do not necessarily have enough money to divorce and support two households. It is still just easier to be in one household, even with a person that you possibly hate, during the economic recession. Military service, in the same way that we saw kind of the impact of World War II on divorce rates immediately following the end of World War II. We see that in general during times of long military deployments. That is a strain on families, on marriages, and when we have periods where we are sending soldiers for these long deployments, or for these kind of military involvements, um, oftentimes the result is we see an increase in divorce rate. Cultural values, as our values have kind of shifted to focusing on individuality and personal autonomy, divorce has just become more common. Social integration. So the idea behind that is back when your family was pretty much your sole uh you know way of engaging with society. You didn't have a lot of other opportunities to really feel like a part of society outside of your family and raising children, maybe going to church on Sunday. Then divorce was a lot less common. Now, of course, people form all types of clubs and organizations, and they have their work, and all of that means that they're integrated into society in multiple ways outside of just their family unit. Then, of course, technology. Technology not only, of course, makes infidelity easier to engage in, but it also makes it easier for people to catch people they are engaging in infidelity, all of which, of course, contributes to the divorce rate. Now, demographic reasons, and this is what kind of that table is pointing out some of these. This is just when we see the people who do and don't get divorced. We notice that there are several factors that seem to more or less contribute to your likelihood to get a divorce. Big one here is parental divorce. They call that the intergenerational transmission theory. Children whose parents divorce are more likely to get a divorce themselves. Age at marriage. The younger you are when you get married, the more likely you are to get a divorce. Premarital pregnancy or childbearing. If you come into marriage already having had a child, um, before you got married, or if you're pregnant at the time that you get married, this is uh, 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 gives you an enhanced risk of divorce. The presence of children, period. Despite what people might say about children, enriching your life and making your life happier, children can increase the risk of getting a divorce, particularly during two time periods, when they are young, under the age of 2, and when they are going through their teenage years. Marriages that have children in those age groups in particular have an enhanced risk of divorcing. There are some race ethnic distinctions. We talked about those when I showed you the graph on the previous slide, with whites and African Americans having a higher risk of divorce than the Latinx and Asian communities. Um, Employment status and income. The more money you make, the less the risk. Being unemployed increases the risk. Long-term unemployment in particular. Religiosity. The more religious you are, the less likely divorce will be an option. Education, once again, similar to income, the more highly educated are less likely to get a divorce. And then similarity between spouses versus dissimilarity. The more dissimilar you and your spouse are, whether it's due to race, whether it's due to education status, whether it's due to income levels and types of jobs, levels of religiosity, but the more different you are, the more likely you are to get a divorce. So all of those are just kind of the demographic factors that we can kind of just see in the statistics. And then there are kind of micro level explanations. And this might be things like unrealistic expectations people may come into the marriage having about what it means to be married or what it means to be a husband or a wife. Obviously, if there's like conflict or abuse, this will contribute to people getting a divorce. Infidelity, which I've already kind of indicated. Communication and just general marital satisfaction. So all of these are contributing factors. When we look at when we first started to see an increase in divorces versus when we reached our peak, that's the period from 1960 to 1980. And that dramatic increase of divorce was called the divorce revolution. And because marriage is the legally recognized kind of contract between two individuals, and because divorce is the way to legally dissolve that contract, unsurprisingly, one of the contributing factors, or one of the primary contributing factors to the divorce revolution, was a piece of law, which was the no fault divorce law. California was the first state to pass such a law. And it made it easier for people to get a divorce because they could get a divorce now for personal reasons rather than making an accusation or charge against the other party, which not only was harder, but it required more time. It usually required more resources and attorneys, and a no fault divorce law allowed people to just say, hey, we have irreconcilable differences. And now either spouse could demand a divorce and they would no longer need a specific reason. And so, as I indicated, the first state to pass that law was California in 1970. But by 1985, all states have some form of that law. Now, of course, one thing that now one kind of consequence of that, beyond just the fact that it contributed to the number of divorces in general, is it also reduced the cases of alimony, because the argument that a spouse, and usually it's the woman but not always, um, is deserves alimony, usually was based on this idea of the other partner um, needing to provide it, to make up or to compensate for something that, that they did, or because they want out of the marriage. No fault divorce laws, now that both partners can mutually just say, irreconcilable differences, this isn't just for us, means that the number of alimony cases has dramatically decreased. And this has really impacted women, um, uh, and their economic status post marriage, um, and has certainly contributed to uh, some of the issues that we see with female headed households being more likely to be impoverished, which we'll talk about more when we get to single parents. Your book raises the question, is too much divorce occurring? The United States does have the highest divorce rate in the world. Um, it's more than 4 times higher than low divorce nations like Italy and Ireland. To what extent you think the divorce is a problem, it varies. The public is divided on this. Unsurprisingly, conservatives are more critical of the high divorce rate than liberals. Usually liberals see divorce as just being a way out of unhappy or possibly even abusive marriage, but it's kind of that focus more on personal autonomy, personal freedom, personal happiness, while conservatives, there is this kind of focus on more morality, financial stability, kind of what's the putting kind of the good of the whole over your own individual happiness. Certainly, one consequence of divorce has to do with, the children. Although courts award support um, to about half of children. Of these, only half receive um, payment. The other half receive either partial payment or no payment. And your book notes that 17 billion in child support is not paid in a year. So this is really important, just because of the number of children that we have in our society that live in poverty, and the fact that children can't really do anything on their own to address their impoverished situations. And our society has tried to deal with this by passing laws like the 1998 Deadbeat Parents Punishment Act, um, but this is still a real problem. And then this problem becomes further complicated by the fact that in a lot of cases, oftentimes, sole or primary custody is given to usually the female parent, which means that the male parent, if we're talking about a heterosexual partnership, is visiting or has some type of visitation. And so one thing we can see is that, when you're looking at the contact that fathers have with their children after divorce, while there are some that have frequent, and that's well over a third, um, a lot have minimal. Some of them have what they indicate as being decreasing, meaning that it starts off as frequent and it decreases over time as their children get older. Very small number, you see the opposite pattern. It starts off minimal and then it increases over time as the children get older and maybe have more say. But oftentimes a parent's ability to visit their child is sometimes related to, especially if they've gone through the court system, is related to them paying the money that's owed. And so, in some cases, children wind up doubly losing. Their parent, their non-custodial parent doesn't pay child support, but then that also means that they also legally can't no longer have a right to see them. So then they lose that non-financial support. They lose that just kind of emotional support as well. And certainly this is a real concern for people, regardless of political party or ideology. Another consequence of divorce is that it is the contributor to this kind of serial marriage, serial monogamy trend that we see in the United States, because that trend where you have marriage, divorce, and remarriage, of course, that's only possible because of the high number of people that, get a divorce. And three out of four people who divorce remarry. Your book notes most of them remarry within 4 years. And then more than 1/3 of all marriages that take place are remarriages. So that means that we have a lot of families that we can call blended families, or another word for blended family is a binuclear family. And that's families in which children live with some combination of biological parents and step parents. And so these binuclear blended families come with their own problems, their own kind of issues and concerns. Children have to learn a new social environment. Partners have to manage relationships with ex-spouses. Step-parent families can come with a high rate of physical and sexual abuse, which is concerning. And then remarriages have an even greater likelihood for divorce than couples in first marriages. So, all of these just kind of present, unique problems to the kind of family dynamic. Now, the second kind of category of family changes that we can talk about are those related to parenting. So this next set of potential issues and problems are going to be those kind of related less to marriage and more to parenting. So one change that we've seen over time in families is that the number of children that Americans think are ideal. And we see that compared to like 1930s, 1940s, more people now feel like smaller families where there's 0 or 1 or 2 children are more ideal than larger families. And so this is just one shift that we've seen. Before we talk about some of those other changes and shifts, let's just talk about in general the process of becoming a parent in the United States. So, although there are some differences based on race and ethnicity, education level, and income, it's worth noting that a little under 3/4 of American adults have children. This means that most American adults have a child at some point. But of these, almost half of all US pregnancies are unintended, a third of all births, meaning that we don't really practice the best family planning in this country. And that's significant because that suggests that at least one third of all children are being born in households where maybe because they weren't intended, they haven't been the best plan for. That people are maybe not in the best financial space to have children. They may not be as mature as they want to be. Their bank accounts may not be as stable as they would like. And all of this, of course, just kind of feeds into our fairly high child poverty rate, if you think about it. Now, obviously, one major change that we've seen when it comes to families and parenting is the rise in single parents. In 2017 yearbook notes, 27% of families with children under the age of 18 had one parent in the household. And this was twice the share in 1970. And I give you a graph that just shows that the percentage of births to unmarried women um, had even from just comparing to the 1990s has gone up consistently. Um, Now, as your book notes, there are these different takes on single parenting, and with liberals and conservatives having different views about it. But at the heart of these views, the concern that most people have here is this issue of poverty. And my apologies if you can hear the clock going off behind me. That's the great thing about doing these videos from home, is I have no control over some of this background noise. But as I was saying, the kind of biggest problem that people would have with single parents is the relationship between single parenthood and poverty. 36% of children who live with one parent are poor. And there also seems to be some intergenerational transmission where people who grow up in single parent households are more likely to become single parents themselves. So there also seems to be this kind of correlation with a cycle, not just growing up in poverty, but a possible cycle of poverty. And it's worth noting that even though I'm talking about single parent homes and most of these homes are unwed mothers, this is not synonymous with teenage mothers. So sometimes when people hear like, oh yes, we've had an increase in single mother households, they interpret that to mean like, oh yes, teenage pregnancy is increasing. And no, we talked about that during our sexuality chapter. Teenage pregnancy, of course, has declined since the 1990s, but single mother-headed households have increased. And this is due to both an increase in the number of children born to unwed women, as well as, of course, the with one consequence of divorce is that sometimes people may start off in a household with two parents and due to divorce wind up in a single parent household over time anyway. Now, this concern between single female headed households and poverty used to have a very kind of like racialized aspect to it because the kind of first government report that raised concerns about this um, specifically was focused on the African American family. And so that was the Moynihan Report in 1965. And what they kind of, one of the things that the report was concerned about was that 20% of children in the African American community were born to single mothers. And at the time, that was a much higher rate compared to other races. What's interesting is that today that statistic has now increased to 70% of African American children are born to single mothers. And as I've already said, the concern here is not necessarily the singleness so much as it is the increased likelihood that these families will be impoverished. Um, and it's worth noting that this has now become not necessarily even a race thing so much as it is just a feminization of poverty thing. And so you might recognize this chart from when we talked about the relationship between poverty and family structure. That single parent headed households, especially ones that are led or headed by a woman, are much more likely to be poor than obviously a married couple, but even a single parent household that's headed by a man. And this isn't just true for African Americans. As you can see, families with a female household or no husband present, whether it's white, non Hispanic, Asian, or Hispanic, all have much higher poverty rates than other family types um, within their own racial group. And of course, as we talked about when we talked about this before, some of this has to do with the fact that when you look at uh, the births to um, single women who do not have as much education and who do not have occupations that pay as much money are more likely to be unwedded mothers than women with more education and jobs with higher compensation. So I say this just to say it's a little bit maybe of a chicken or egg situation. It's not so much that having a child outside of wedlock makes you poor, um, so much as it might be um, women who are already poor then have children outside of wedlock, and that makes them even poorer. And all of this, of course, um, just kind of goes back to these old gender roles. Because if you think about why single parent households headed by men aren't as likely to be as impoverished, it has a lot to do with, of course, the different standing that men have in the work sphere. Um, and this is true when they are single parents themselves. But it's also worth noting that in married couples, married heterosexual couples, this idea of men being the provider still exists today. Although it doesn't exist to the same extent as it did back when we had clear cut separate spheres, where pretty much being a good provider was all that men were uh, allowed or encouraged to do. A lot of stress was put on them to provide, and they were um, discouraged to take time away from work and to not focus on work. Um, we still see this today, of course, with the number of men who see nurturing as being largely feminine behavior, and who resist being stay at home dads. And men who do take a lot of time for their families are sometimes placed on what is called the daddy track at work, meaning that they are less likely to get the plum assignments or to get promotions or to be paid or compensated as much as men who do not prioritize their families in the same way. And all of this, of course, is led to kind of another kind of distinctive shift in the modern family, which is the fact that in today's family, compared to that traditional nuclear model where women stay at home, is you now have both parents working for income in about 52% of US families. And so this means for those women, they do what is oftentimes called what your book calls a double shift, what I call the second shift. They go and work for pay, and then they come home and they do most of the housework, most of the cooking, most of the childcare. Um, and this has become, of course, even further complicated by the fact that since post information revolution, more people can now bring work home, and they bring workplace activities and concerns into the homes, even further blurring that distinction between the shifts. And so, unlike the past where women were more likely to not work outside of the home, so they took care of their children um, in the home until the child was, old enough to go to school. Now, with all the men and women who both work outside of the home, the question is who's taking care of who is providing this child care. because most married mothers are also working mothers, and 59% of them had infants, 65% of them had preschoolers, 75% have school age children. And so when you look at, what are those childcare arrangements, you see that, there has been about a quarter depend on center-based childcare, but daycare, of course, is very expensive. um, a little more than that depend on relative care in the child's or the relative's home. Oftentimes that is preferred for people because of the diminished costs, or it's either less or perhaps even free. But it comes with its own risk, about placing your child with someone, especially if it's not in their own home, but placing them with someone that isn't licensed to provide care, in a home that isn't licensed, certainly can come with risk for abuse or neglect. um, you can see that some people, the parents have to provide some type of care, and it might be that they organize their shifts in different ways, or they do work from home part of the time to address the child care. um, but all of this, is reflects a new concern that families have to address. Um, and these concerns involve both time and money, as well as quality of care. Childcare options usually depend on income, and for people, if we're talking about school age children, you know there are 4.5 million latchkey children. So these are children that go to school and then they get the bus and they let themselves in, and they spend several hours at home by themselves, waiting until their parent gets off of work. And there are certainly concerns that people have about what is going on during that time that they are home by themselves, the possible risks there. Um, the U.S. government itself, doesn't support, really only provides support for childcare through income tax deduction. I've talked about in previous lectures, about uh, kind of the lack of support that the government has, that we don't have a lot of family friendly policies in place in this country. The Family Medical Leave Act of 1993 gives time off for family and personal reasons, but that's unpaid time. So your ability to take it is somewhat based on your ability to not be paid for a certain number of weeks. We've discussed that there is no federal mandate that provides paid maternity leave or paid paternity leave. If you live in a state where there is paid maternity leave, for instance, that is just your state, you could go 1, 2 states over and be in a possible very different situation. And it is worth noting that there are a lot of countries that do this better than we do, both in terms of maternity leave, as well as paternity leave, which is that other map that you see here. The kind of final kind of shift, of course, we can talk about in regards to modern parenting, has to do with same sex parenting. 6 million US children have an LGBT parent. Um, like everything related to the LGBT community, public opinion can be divided, but it's worth noting that research shows that there is very little difference in a child growing up in a heterosexual versus homosexual household. So there are no very measurable differences. And a lot of the problems that might exist in these families have a lot more to do with stigma than the family form itself. So it has a lot more to do with other people's kind of prejudices and treatment of the family than any problems within the actual family. We've the research that has been done on that has been pretty conclusive around that point. And the final thing that your book kind of notes as being a change in regards to parenting in modern families has a lot to do with like uh, how families are formed in the first place. As as noted, as people are waiting longer to get married, this has, of course, impacted their childbearing window. And this means that you are seeing women having to turn to um, all types of kind of high tech reproduction procedures to help with the pregnancy, the process of getting pregnant. Your book mentions too in vitro fertilization as well as surrogate motherhood, both of which are extremely expensive. Um, well, it's worth noting that there is this cultural lag. We have had scientific discoveries that we can do things with science in regards to reproduction and reproduction technologies. We can do things that we as a public aren't sure if we how we feel about them and if they're acceptable to use. In vitro fertilization is one form of assisted reproductive technology that has become much more common and accepted in usage compared to what it was even 10, 15 years ago. So now let's switch briefly to people that are choosing to not become a parent because that has become more common in today's world than what it was previously. And it's worth noting that childlessness can be involuntary or voluntary. If it's voluntary, we oftentimes go by the term child free. And there has been one particular form of family, and you can kind of see that on that Time magazine cover there. And that's the DINKs, dual income, no kids. And there has become an increase in this family type where they're married and they both are working, and usually they have careers, so jobs that they have invested a lot into, and that usually are come with a pretty decent uh, salaries and benefits, and their focus is not on having children. So this too is a rejection of that nuclear family model, because although they are married, they are choosing to not have a child, to remain child free. And why has there been an increase in this type? Part of it might be a response to the demands of the ideology of intensive mothering. So there is this ideology that being a mother is supposed to be all encompassing, it's supposed to be the most important thing you do. There's all these expectations that come along with what being a good mother looks like. And that for women, especially women that know that they will be working mothers, this just seems like a lot. And for some women, they're just rejecting that expectation that they give into this. It opens up the opportunities to do other things. Child-free couples are much more likely to travel and to travel globally than couples that have children. Of course, the role of birth control and abortion has made people's if they are choosing to be child free, the availability of both of these is allows them to kind of better uphold that choice. In general, there's a sense of ambivalence around parenting and children in today's generation that uh, we see more so than previous generations, or they're at least more likely to admit it than previous generations. And then finally, financial concerns and work pressures. Um, as noted, children are not an economic benefit anymore, they are a cost. And uh, one consequence of the recession and economic downturns has been that some people have just decided to refrain from taking on this cost of having children. So this rise of the child-free couple is the final of the changes in the modern family that I will go over in this video. And yeah, and kind of like previous chapters, I will not be providing a video for the theory and the political ideology part. It's very short. As always, it's just kind of that overview of structural functionalism, symbolic interactionism, social conflict, and feminist theory, followed by a discussion of what type of solutions conservatives, liberals, and the radical left would offer for some of these problems.